Big Shaq had worked hard to buy his dream home, a beautiful house with a private pool, a rare luxury in his fancy neighborhood. To him, the pool wasn't just for relaxing, it was proof of his success. But lately, there was an unexpected problem: his neighbor Barbara. She wasn't friendly and never smiled at him. Yet, for some reason, she had no problem using his pool. Big Shaq first saw her early in the summer, floating in the water with sunglasses on like she owned the place. Confused, he walked up to her and politely told her this was private property. Barbara barely reacted. She waved him off like he was a mosquito and kept sunbathing. "It's just a pool," she scoffed. "What's the big deal? We're neighbors." At first, Big Shaq let it slide, thinking maybe she didn't understand, but she kept coming back. Every few days, Barbara strolled into his backyard like she lived there. Sometimes she even brought friends. Big Shaq got more and more frustrated but stayed calm. He told her to stop, reminding her that she was trespassing. Barbara always had some excuse. "This whole area was built for the community," she said one afternoon, while dipping her toes in the water. "If you can afford this place, then I should be able to use it too." That comment bothered Big Shaq. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Like she believed a black man owning something this nice was a mistake that needed fixing. He tried one last time to reason with her. "Barbara, I bought this house. This pool isn't public. If you want to swim, you can join a club or get your own." Her response was instant and dismissive. "That's ridiculous," she scoffed, standing up and drying off with one of his towels. "People like you shouldn't be so selfish." Big Shaq felt his patience running out. It was clear Barbara didn't just think she had the right to use his pool. She thought he didn't deserve to have it. By the time she left that day, he knew being polite wasn't going to work. He had to do something. Big Shaq had dealt with rude neighbors before, but Barbara was different. It was bad enough that she kept sneaking into his backyard like it was a public park. But the way she acted, like his success was some kind of mistake, made it even worse. Enough was enough. The next morning, Big Shaq took action. He put a strong lock on the gate and set up security cameras around the yard. He even put up a sign that said, "Private property, no trespassing." For the first time in weeks, he felt at peace. That peace lasted exactly 2 days. On the third afternoon, Big Shaq was inside when he heard a loud rattling noise from the backyard. He checked his security camera feed, and of course, there she was, Barbara. She was gripping the locked gate, shaking it like crazy. Her face was red with anger. She muttered to herself, but through the camera's microphone, Big Shaq could hear bits and pieces. Unbelievable, and how dare he? He watched as she pulled out her phone and started pacing in front of the gate. Moments later, sirens echoed in the distance. Big Shaq sighed. He already knew what was coming. Within minutes, 3 police officers arrived. Barbara ran toward them, waving her arms like crazy. "Thank God you're here," she shouted, pointing at the house. "That man is threatening me. He locked me out for no reason. He's trying to scare me." Big Shaq stepped outside, making sure to keep his hands where they could see them. He didn't want any trouble. "Good afternoon, officers. What seems to be the problem?" One of the cops, an older man with tired eyes, looked Big Shaq up and down before turning to Barbara, who was panting like she had just run a marathon. "She says you threatened her," the officer said carefully. Big Shaq didn't even flinch. "I haven't spoken to her today," he replied, "but I do have security footage." Barbara's face twisted in anger. "He's lying!" she shrieked. "He's been harassing me for weeks. He put up that lock just to keep me out." Big Shaq pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. "Actually, I put up the lock because she keeps trespassing on my property, and I've got the video to prove it." He handed the phone to the officer, who watched the footage in silence. The video showed Barbara trying to break into the pool area, her tantrum caught in perfect detail. The second officer leaned in to watch. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Ma'am," the older cop said after a moment, his voice firm, "this is his property. You don't have the right to be here." Barbara's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But he's being unfair. He's keeping me out on purpose." Yes, Big Shaq said dryly. That's exactly the point. The officers exchanged looks. One of them turned back to Barbara. If you set foot on this property again, you'll be arrested for trespassing. Do you understand? Barbara's face turned an alarming shade of purple. She let out a frustrated growl, spun around, and stomped away. Big Shaq watched her go, shaking his head. He knew this wasn't over. People like Barbara didn't just let things go. They struck back. But what she didn't know was that Big Shaq wasn't done either. And he had an idea that would change everything. Barbara wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She had a mean streak, a sense of entitlement, and worst of all, no shame. After the 911 call, Big Shaq thought she might back off. Instead, she doubled down. He caught her glaring at him whenever he walked past her house. A few times, she even stood on her porch, arms crossed, muttering under her breath as he went about his day. It was clear Barbara wasn't done, and neither was he. Big Shaq had an idea. If Barbara was going to make his life difficult, maybe it was time he learned more about hers. That night, he sat at his computer and started digging. First, he ran a basic background check. Nothing unusual popped up, but then he went deeper, searching public records, old newspaper archives, and even ancestry websites. What he found made his stomach turn. Barbara's family had a long, messy history, one that went back for generations. Her grandfather and great-grandfather weren't just members of a hateful group. They were leaders. They held high-ranking positions in one of the most dangerous branches of the KKK. There were old pictures of them in full robes, standing next to burning crosses. Newspaper articles linked them to violent rallies and hate crimes. But it didn't stop there. Barbara's parents had their own history of racism. They weren't part of the group, but they had donated money to white supremacist organizations and had even joined protests against desegregation back in the day. Big Shaq leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. He had always suspected Barbara's arrogance came from something deeper than just a bad attitude. But this was bigger than he thought. No wonder she had reacted so badly to a black man owning something she thought she deserved. She had been raised to believe that people like him shouldn't succeed. Big Shaq let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers on the desk. He had all the proof he needed, but he wasn't just going to sit on it. Barbara had spent weeks trying to make his life miserable. Now it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. He had a plan, and she wouldn't see it coming. Big Shaq wasn't the type to go after revenge. He usually let karma handle things. But after everything Barbara had done, the weeks of harassment, the false 911 call, and now the dark truth about her family, he realized something. Barbara had never faced real consequences in her life. That was about to change. With all the information he had gathered, Big Shaq made a call, not to the police, but to a journalist he knew. This journalist covered stories about racism and discrimination. He shared everything: Barbara's entitled behavior, her false accusations, and most importantly, her family's deep connections to the KKK. The journalist was very interested. A day later, an article was published online. The headline alone caused a huge reaction. White woman calls 911 on black neighbor. Her family's dark secret exposed. The article covered everything from Barbara's history of harassment to the shocking truth about her ancestors. And it didn't just stay local. The story spread fast, hitting social media and getting shared thousands of times. And Barbara? She was furious. Big Shaq was watering his front lawn when she stormed onto his driveway, phone in hand, her face red with rage. "You did this," she screamed, waving her phone at him. "You're trying to ruin my life." Big Shaq didn't even flinch. "I didn't ruin anything, Barbara. Your family did that all on their own." "You have no right," she spat. "That's all lies. My grandfather was a war hero, not some... You can keep telling yourself that," Big Shaq said calmly. "But the truth is out there now, and people aren't happy." Barbara's breathing grew heavier, her whole body shaking. Then, in an act of pure desperation, she did something that sealed her fate. She lunged at Big Shaq. Or at least she tried to. Fueled by rage but slowed by her weight, Barbara barely made it 2 steps before she stumbled forward. Just as she was about to catch herself, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. The police had arrived. It turned out that ever since the article dropped, Barbara had been making threats online, posting hateful messages, and even vowing to get back at whoever exposed her. Someone had reported her behavior, and the authorities had been watching her. And now her time was up. As soon as the officer stepped out, Barbara panicked. "This is all fake," she screamed. "He's trying to make me look bad. I'm the victim here." But when they moved toward her, she did the last thing anyone expected. She ran. It was almost funny. Barbara, red-faced and sweating, trying to escape from trained officers. She made it about 20 feet before she tripped over the curb and crashed to the ground. Within seconds, she was surrounded. "You're under arrest for making false reports and attempted assault," an officer said as they cuffed her. Big Shaq just stood there, watching as they put her into the squad car. For the first time in weeks, he felt at peace. Barbara had spent her whole life thinking she could do whatever she wanted without facing consequences. But today, that changed, and he made sure of it. Barbara always thought rules were for other people, that she could get away with anything. But as she sat in the courtroom, hands clasped together, her face still blotchy from the stress of the night before, she finally started to realize she was in real trouble. The courtroom was packed. A few reporters sat in the back whispering as they took notes. Local residents, including some of Big Shaq's neighbors, had come to watch. Even Big Shaq himself was there, sitting near the front, arms crossed, watching everything. Then the door opened, and the judge walked in. Barbara's breath caught in her throat. The judge was black. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. She had spent her whole life looking down on people like him, and now he was the one deciding her fate. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood as Judge Johnson took his seat. He was a tall, serious-looking man with sharp eyes that immediately locked onto Barbara. He flipped through some papers, then looked up. "Ms. Thomas, you are being charged with trespassing, filing false police reports, and attempted assault. How do you plead?" Barbara swallowed hard. Her lawyer nudged her, whispering something under his breath. But she barely heard him. The room felt hot. Too many eyes were on her. Sweat trickled down the back of her neck. "Not guilty," she muttered, her voice cracking. Judge Johnson didn't react. He simply nodded and turned to the prosecutor. "Proceed." The next 30 minutes were brutal. The prosecutor laid out everything: Barbara's history of harassment, the fake 911 call, her threats, and, of course, the moment she tried to run from the police. Witnesses, including Big Shaq, testified. The security footage of her throwing a tantrum by the pool played on the screen. Barbara squirmed in her seat, her face turning from red to pale. Then the judge spoke. "Miss Thomas, your actions are some of the most shocking examples of entitlement and discrimination I've seen in this courtroom." Barbara pressed her lips into a thin line. "You trespassed multiple times, tried to use law enforcement against an innocent man, and completely disregarded the law. Given your history, I have serious concerns about your behavior." He paused, then looked her straight in the eye. "Do you have anything to say for yourself before I proceed with sentencing?" That's when Barbara lost it. She jumped up from her seat, her chair screeching against the floor. "This is Bull Shaster's tea," she screamed. "You're all against me. This whole thing is rigged. That thug set me up." Gas spread through the courtroom. Her lawyer put his head in his hands. "Miss Thomas," Judge Johnson said calmly, "I strongly suggest you control yourself." Barbara ignored him. She pointed a finger right at him. "You're just another affirmative action hire. You shouldn't even be a judge." The room went dead silent. Then she said the one thing that sealed her fate. "I swear, if I ever see you outside this courtroom—" The bailiffs were on her before she could finish, grabbing her arms as she thrashed. Judge Johnson didn't flinch. He just adjusted his glasses and picked up his gavel. Given your blatant disrespect for this court and your threats against a sitting judge, I am extending your sentence beyond what was originally recommended, he said firmly. Barbara's face crumpled. Number, you can't do that. But it was too late. The gavel came down with a sharp bang. Sentencing will be issued immediately. Barbara had dug her own grave, and now she had to lie in it. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Barbara was dragged out, still kicking and screaming. But there was nothing she could do now. The judge's ruling was final. Her fate was sealed. Barbara was sentenced to 1 year in jail for trespassing, filing false police reports, and threatening a judge. What started as a small case had turned into something much bigger, all because she couldn't control her own hatred. News of the incident spread fast. The story hit social media, and people wasted no time tearing Barbara apart. A video of her courtroom meltdown racked up millions of views in just a few days. Memes flooded the internet. Imagine being racist and dumb enough to threaten a judge, one user wrote. Plot twist. She thought the pool was free, but jail is really free, another joked. Reporters started digging into her past. Her secrets were exposed for the world to see, her family's KKK ties, her history of harassing black neighbors, and even complaints from old jobs about her racist behavior. Barbara was officially canceled. Meanwhile, Big Shaq could finally relax. For the first time in months, he could enjoy his pool without worry. No more Barbara sneaking in, complaining, or calling the cops. The whole neighborhood, tired of Barbara's nonsense, stood by him. One weekend, his neighbors surprised him with a small celebration. They put up decorations, brought food, and gathered around his pool. It wasn't just about Barbara anymore. It was about standing up to racism and supporting each other. Big Shaq smiled as he looked around. He had bought this home to enjoy a peaceful life. And now, that's exactly what he had. But Barbara? She sat in a cold jail cell, no pool in sight and no one to bail her out. She had spent her life looking down on others, but now she was at her lowest point. And karma had no mercy for people like her. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more.